Welcome, viewers, to this, the third and concluding webinar of the Decarbonization series, An Alberta Perspective. In the earlier episodes, we explored the global energy economy and the objective of the decarbonization of energy. We then reviewed various emerging technologies addressing climate change. Today, our objective is to formulate a pathway to sustainability, that is, actions for achieving the delicate balance between energy fueling the economy and the environment. Our moderator will be Jim Carter, who will introduce each of the three presenters and their discussion. At their conclusion, I will then introduce a half-hour chat to entertain questions from you, our viewers. Jim has extensive corporate management and board governance experience in the energy sector. He is well aware of the issues and options for addressing climate change without gutting the energy industry on which the economy depends, not just Alberta, not just Canada, but the world economy. Jim and the three presenters bring a balanced perspective to the task of recommending a pathway to sustainability for accommodating the often conflicting energy, economic, and environmental objectives. Welcome, Jim. Over to you.
Thank you, Perry, for that introduction. It's my pleasure to be the moderator of today's webinar panel discussion on this important topic. And as Perry has noted, this is the third and final panel of the series, and it's entitled Energy Transition, the Pathway to Energy and Economic Sustainability. Now, I will set the stage for today's discussion with a few opening remarks, but let me first introduce our three distinguished participants. First up today will be Kate Chisholm. Kate is the Senior Vice President and Chief Strategic and Sustainability Officer of Capital Power, and has had a long career with Capital Power and its predecessor company, Epcor Utilities Limited. And Kate is going to talk to us about, the journey that Capital Power has had over the last few years, going from coal-fired power and renewables to, a closing down of the coal-fired assets and some of the challenges and things that are associated with that. Next up is Eddy Isaacs. Eddy is the immediate past president of the Canadian Academy of Engineering, and he's the former CEO of Alberta Innovates Energy and Environmental Solutions. And Eddy, of course, is no stranger to the world of energy research in Alberta, and was moderator of webinar number 2 in this series, Decarbonization and Energy Technologies Addressing Climate Change. Our last speaker is Dave Collyer, and Dave was a member of the senior executive team at Shell Canada for many years, with a long career with Shell. And he served as country chair and president for Shell Canada in his last posting, and then went on to become the president and CEO of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, which of course is the upstream oil and gas industry association. He currently serves on several boards, including and chairing ERA, which is the Board of Emissions Reduction Alberta, which originated as a Climate Change Emissions Management Corp entity that Eric Newell established for the government back in the 2008-2009 time period. And of course, it adjudicates the funds collected from large emitters on the carbon tax and distributes those to various technologies that work to reduce CO2 emissions. So a very important element of Alberta's approach to all of this. So we're very fortunate to have these three very high caliber participants joining us today. So thank you for agreeing to do that, all of you. Now I'll make a few comments to frame today's discussion, and then turn it over to the presenters, who will each speak for about 12 or so minutes, after which we will open the floor for broader dialogue. Excuse me. Now, from my perspective as a mining and oil and gas professional who has worked all across Canada, and indeed for some 50 years now, I appreciate the long journey that it has been to make sure that we have a reliable and affordable source of energy. And now and also appreciate the importance that is to a strong economy. Before COVID-19, the world in 2019 was consuming 101 million barrels of oil per day. And then, of course, in 2020, that declined significantly because of COVID-19. But in 2021, as we progressed through the year, we were almost back to the 100 million barrels per day run rate, without a significant amount of airline travel, I might add, when the Omicron variant temporarily slowed things down a bit. So, you know, after 19, we dipped down in 20, and then we came back up in 21. Now, when I think of a world that we live in today with 7.6 billion people, and one where it is likely to grow to 10 billion people by just about any report that you read on that subject, I believe we're going to need all of the forms of energy that technology can offer. Now, that does not mean that we should not evolve to cleaner forms of energy. We ought to go all out on that, which also entails making our current forms of energy cleaner, as well as developing renewables. Unfortunately, the broader discussion has pitted one against the other as an either-or situation, instead of one and the other, which is the kind of thinking that I think we need to instill if we are going to have success in lowering carbon emissions while at the same time continuing with affordable and reliable energy. Now, in this great country of ours, we've been bestowed with tremendous natural resources that supply energy. The oil sands, which took years to develop, but which are now a huge economic engine for the Canadian economy, is an example of that. Of the 3.8 million barrels of crude oil produced per day in Canada now, 86% of it comes from the oil sands. We have abundant natural gas. And I should just say there, by the way, if we hadn't developed the oil sands, we're the third largest crude oil reserves in the world. If we hadn't developed the oil sands, Alberta would be producing about 1 million barrels a day. We'd be a marginal player at best on the world scene. We're now the fifth largest producer of crude oil as a country in the world, and we have the third largest reserves. So the development of the oil sands and the importance of it should not be understated. We have abundant natural gas in the Montney field in Alberta, BC. And in fact, Canada has 1,300 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, compared to the US that has 800 trillion. So there's a tremendous opportunity for LNG to replace coal-fired power in developing countries. And we have great hydroelectric resources in BC and Manitoba and Quebec and Labrador. And we have huge uranium deposits in northern Saskatchewan. Now, having been bestowed this abundance of natural resources, I believe it is incumbent on us as a nation to take a broader global view to enabling the world to have a pathway to energy and economic sustainability. Now, by doing this, we will have a much more positive impact on reducing CO2 emissions globally than we can by being parochial about it and simply slashing our own CO2 emissions, which as a country are about 1.5% of total global emissions. I believe that renewables have a big place in our future, and with the technology that we have developed and applied in the hydrocarbon energy space as an example, we should be able to excel in renewables. And we don't give a lot of airtime to some of the things that we've developed in this country on the conventional drilling space, things like directional drilling. Everybody thinks it was invented in Houston. Well, it was invented with a combination of effort from Alberta and Houston. And the technology there is just advancing very much and really helping the production of conventional oil. It is important, though, to remember that renewables have the ability to impact electricity, which really only accounts for about 19% of total energy consumption today. The other 80% comes from hydrocarbons, which, by the way, is about the same as it was 30 years ago. So as we think about renewables, they can impact electricity generation, but it's kind of limited to that at this point. Renewable contribution, however, could increase with green hydrogen through electrolysis of water, but that will be a very expensive form of energy, at least in the near term. However, this can be helped by making blue hydrogen as a first step learning opportunity on the path forward, using our hydrocarbon knowledge and capability. We should just think about that for a moment. We know lots about making hydrogen in Alberta, since we make huge volumes of it to process heavy oils into lighter, cleaner products, both in our upgraders and in the refineries that we operate. We also have the pore space available in depleted oil reservoirs where we have a deep understanding of the geology that can be used for carbon capture and sequestration. All of the components that we need to do carbon capture and sequestration are already in operation in different forms in Alberta as we speak. And in fact, we now have a successful combination of all of those in the form of the Quest project at the Shell upgrader and refinery in Fort Saskatchewan. And by the way, that was really born out of the contribution that Ed Stelmach, the commitment that he made to $2 billion to undertake letting Alberta be the leader in carbon capture and sequestration. And we shouldn't forget that. There's a real opportunity in all of that. Now, Hal Quisley in his in webinar number 1, which was moderated by Eric Newell, who is with us today. That's great, Eric, that you're here. And Hal talked about the huge potential for LNG that BC and Alberta have by jointly developing the Montney gas field. This LNG could be displacing the many coal-fired power plants being planned for China and India, making a large contribution to overall global emissions. And let me just make a point here. 10 years ago, Canada did not have an LNG economy at all. We weren't doing any LNG, and neither was the US. They didn't have any either 10 or 11 years ago. Today, when you look at it, the US now has 20% of the world LNG market, of about 50 million tons a year of LNG that's shipped today. 20% of it comes out of the US. We are still at 0, even though they're trying to chill it in Louisiana, which is a whole lot harder to do with their ambient temperature than it is for us to do in Kitimat. And of course, we're building the Canada LNG facility, and it will come online, but it's a little bit of a reflection of how long it seems to take us to get things done relative to others that we compete with. Now, in order for all of these opportunities to be properly sorted and acted upon in Canada, I believe that we need a Canadian industrial strategy that involves the federal government and the provinces. And when I say provinces, I mean all of the provinces, not just the 2 that are most likely to determine the election output at the federal level. And it needs to include preserving the economy while reducing global CO2 emissions, properly supported by well thought out public policy and an efficient regulatory process. I think this can be accomplished by working with Indigenous communities to their mutual socioeconomic advantage in streamlining the regulatory approval process. I spent 40 years along with Eric here working with the Indigenous people in this country. And I believe that if the right conversations were had with the right people, that we could encourage them to be full participants in the opportunities that might be here. I don't believe that that's been really done very well on this to this point. The path forward, by and large, will be determined by economics. And as a country, we need to set ourselves up for success by being productive, efficient, and reliable, while being leaders in environmental performance. And I think we can do all of that if we set ourselves up for success with the proper plan and the right approach to it. So I'm going to leave my remarks there for right now and as introductory comments. And I'm going to now ask Kate Chisholm to take the floor. Kate, are you ready?
Thank you very much. It's both a pleasure and a privilege to be here. So I'm going to tell you what Kate thinks. I want you to know that some of these thoughts are not endorsed by Capital Power, but you'll be able to tell the difference between the ones that are and the ones that aren't. In my opinion, the world needs to come to terms with the fact, as has been discussed, that the goal of powering the world with 100% renewables is an absolutely impossible pipe dream. I completely understand its intuitive attraction to people who don't understand energy systems, but it simply cannot be done. To be clear, I'm not saying the power grid needs to indefinitely put up with carbon emissions from thermal power, but it can't do without thermal power, so we need to decarbonize it. Recent unfortunate events like frigid weather in Texas and Alberta and drought and wildfires in California and up the West Coast illustrate the importance of backup when the wind isn't blowing, the sun isn't shining, and water isn't flowing as freely as we'd like. For example, in Alberta's record-breaking heat wave this summer, only 8 megawatts of Alberta's more than 2,000 megawatts of wind was generating. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that 8 megawatts was from Capital Power's Halkirk wind farm. Although solar was running strong at an 84% capacity factor, the total output from all of Alberta's hydro, wind, and solar was only 570 megawatts out of the province's total 3,200 megawatts of renewable capacity, for a capacity factor of only 18%. In non-power speak, this means that on average, 82% of the power consumed in that period was from coal and natural gas. These extreme weather events are not going away. They are going to increase in intensity and in frequency. In fact, all credible studies looking at deep decarbonization scenarios predict an ongoing role for natural gas in the global electricity supply for 2 reasons. Firstly, they confirm the necessity of some kind of extremely fast ramping and flexibly reliable backup power, particularly as the penetration of intermittent renewable increases. In some areas, batteries will be able to smooth intermittency for short periods because they, like gas, can be dispatched and turned off instantaneously. However, in areas subject to weather events that last more than a few hours, natural gas with CCUS is a safer, non-emitting short to medium-term bet. Decarbonized natural gas will support system reliability by ensuring clean spinning reserve is always available to keep the lights on reliably and at a cost that avoids rate shock and energy poverty. The second reason experts acknowledge the ongoing importance of decarbonized natural gas relates to the developing world's growing demand for electricity and the resulting forecast growth of its coal and natural gas supply in response. The developing world can't afford to research, develop, and commercialize the tools necessary to decarbonize this part of their supply. The developed world will have to do it for them. Alberta and Canada will lead the way for CCUS and hydrogen parts of decarbonization, becoming world leaders. I agree with both the International Energy Agency and the UN's International Panel on Climate Change that using existing technology will be the only practical way to ensure that we move the needle sufficiently before 2030 to contain global warming. By the time the energy industry has designed, permitted, financed, and constructed the kind of infrastructure that will be needed to meet Canada's 2030 reduction goal, there won't be any extra time left within which to develop and deploy new technologies. First, therefore, pre-2030, point source emissions will be physically reduced where feasible through post-combustion capture or hydrogen blending. Second, where emissions can't be captured at source, due to technical, economic, or social constraints, we'll pursue negative emissions technologies such as direct air capture post-2030 to capture and remove CO2 directly from the atmosphere. For example, pre-2030, Capital Power plans to be completely off coal by the end of 2023. That's a full 6 years earlier than we're required to do so. This will immediately reduce our emissions by 3.4 megatons, while also increasing our generating capacity, providing more than 40% reduction in emissions from our Genesee site, despite a more than 40% increase in its generation capacity. Because of Alberta's competitive energy market, we forecast that this repowering investment will also have a further knock-on environmental benefit of reducing the overall emissions from the Alberta power sector by another full megaton as the increased cleaner capacity displaces higher emitting units on the merit curve. All in all, we're reducing Alberta power emissions by approximately 4.5 megatons per year within the next 2 years, but we're still burning natural gas. Next, we hope to capture the point source CO2 emissions from 2 units and sequester them to further reduce our absolute emissions at Genesee by another 3 megatons per year. We hope to have shovels in the ground on this CCUS project by the end of 2023 for a COD by the end of 2026. So that's about 7.5 megatons per year of emission reductions from these 2 projects alone. And we're still burning gas. We're also finishing the Genesee Carbon Conversion Center, which I'm particularly proud of and interested in. It will capture some more carbon from the third unit out there and convert it into carbon nanotubes that we hope to be sold to raise revenue that offsets the cost of capture. Specifically, we're partnering with Lehigh Cement in the hopes that Lehigh can reduce its downstream emissions by incorporating the carbon nanotubes into its cement mixtures. Carbon nanotubes are stronger than steel, lighter than aluminum, and more conductive than copper. And we believe that incorporating them into the things like cement and steel manufacture and aluminum smelting will be very attractive for those processes as the price on carbon rises. Eventually, if enough demand can be created for the nanotubes, direct air capture units that create the nanotubes could become independently economic and be placed anywhere. Once these projects are complete, they'll have the capacity to produce something like 10,000 to 11,000 gigawatt hours, or approximately twice the clean energy of British Columbia's Site C, and enough to meet the entire Alberta residential demand. This production would be about 5 times the energy of all Alberta hydro generation combined and equal to all of the renewable energy Alberta generated last year. It is very significant. The challenge for us in producing carbon nanotubes is not technological. We already know we can do it. We've done it. The challenge is purely financial. Without a CO2 point source, there's no carbon tax avoidance to boost the economics. So we need to establish that market for carbon nanotubes or other products that can be made from them to raise revenue to cover the capture costs. In addition, because of its locational flexibility and minimal water consumption, direct air capture would be one good potential solution to upstream oil and gas emissions. The International Panel on Climate Change estimates that even if we were to reduce the world's emissions to zero, we'll still need approximately 10 gigatons of net CO2 removal per year by the year 2050 in order to keep the global temperature rise under 2 degrees. This is why, for example, the X Prize, along with Elon Musk and his foundation, are offering a $100 million prize for the best scalable carbon removal solution. To achieve the necessary scale, direct air capture will need government incentives and early CO2 utilization market opportunities to assist commercialization and allow the technologies to move more quickly along the cost reduction curve. We share our carbon conversion strategy with numerous others who have begun making hydrogen, plastics, methanol, building materials, solvents, synthetic rubber, batteries, electronics, automobiles, vodka, detergents, soaps, fertilizer, furniture, packaging, clothing, shoes, and jewelry from captured carbon. Captured CO2 can theoretically be made into any kind of fuel or chemical that is currently based on petroleum. The trick is figuring out either how to do it so the product is cost competitive with fossil fuel derived products, or convincing the public to buy carbon derived products at a slight premium because they benefit the environment. In fact, McKinsey estimates that by 2030, CO2-based products could be worth between $800 billion and $1 trillion. And the use of CO2 just for producing fuel, enriching concrete, and generating power could reduce GHG emissions by 1 billion metric tons per year. The Global Carbon Initiative further projects that with the proper government incentives, the overall CO2-based product industry could utilize 7 billion metric tons of CO2 each year, about 15% of our current global emissions by 2030. As an aside, at both COP26 and in their platform for the September election, the Trudeau Liberals said they're not willing to wait for other governments to act on climate change. And they expressly specified the important role the private sector should play in building and financing projects, and that market forces should decide technologies. Well, Prime Minister, the Alberta energy industry is ready to help, but we need policies that support innovation and commercialization and deal with geographic spillover issues like carbon border adjustments. Most of all, we need a lot less red tape, and we need to be able to better balance NIMBY interests with the greater public good. Of course, that's a difficult proposition for any politician, so public education is also very, very urgently needed. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kate. That was a great overview, a lot of information there. One interesting piece that I bumped into when I chaired the Alberta Carbon Capture and Storage Development Council back in 2009 And Dave Collyer was actually on there with me, as well as Don Lowry from EPCOR, you'll recall, was the, the direct capture from air. It seemed like a real far out idea back then. And we actually had David Keith on the panel as well. And David went on to be a professor at Harvard and continues to pursue that technology. But has it advanced a lot since those days? And is it getting to be more, possible to use and do?
There are some direct air capture units in operation at the moment. We ourselves had a very small one in operation at our Shepherd plant just outside Calgary. The problem is it's very, very expensive. And so we need to create those markets for the products made from the captured carbon to lift the economics. But it is completely technologically viable already.
Mm-hmm. That was the issue at the time, of course, too, was the cost. Well, thank you, Kate. One of the things that you've done is really highlight how much actually activity you've got going on in the behind the scenes here. And I think that that's probably true for all of industry in Canada. We never see it. We never read about it. And I'm not even sure that governments totally appreciate it because it's hard for them to process all of this stuff. But I think therein lies, some of the solution on a path forward. It's going to be a bumpy road, but we've got a lot of things going on and a lot of willingness to try to do some things to help solve this. So with that, I'm going to move on to Eddy Isaacs. Eddy.
Thanks very much, Jim. I really appreciate this opportunity to give a little bit of thinking or give my thoughts on the subject, and also thanks to Perry for organizing these webinars. I'll actually start by referring to the IPCC special report of November 2018, which followed the Paris conference. The IPCC was asked, what are the global greenhouse gas emission pathways? In other words, what are the solutions to limit the increase in global temperatures emissions to 1.5 degrees C. That's above pre-industrial levels. 3 years later, the IPCC produced a report which envisions that the global emissions would peak in the early 2020s, about now, and then decline, reaching 45% reduction by 2030, and then declining to net zero by 2050. And any remaining fossil fuel emissions would be countered by carbon retention in the soil and the forest using CCS. And as Kate mentioned, negative emissions such as bioenergy with CCS. I think direct air capture was not something that they considered at that time, or they mentioned it, but didn't consider it. It would begin about 2040, that's bioenergy with CCS, and would continue with CCS to the end of the century to remove carbon from the atmosphere. The IPCC modeled 4 scenarios. The scenarios were based on demand for the energy. So how much was the demand? In the first scenario, they said, well, we could have energy efficiency projects that would reduce the demand by 32%. In the second scenario, by 5%. In the third scenario, it would increase by 21%. And the fourth scenario, the final energy demand would be 44% relative to 2010. Their baseline year was 2010. And the 44% is very similar to what the IEA was predicting would happen by 2050 in terms of energy demand. In order to get this kind of demand, there would be, and meet the 1.5 degrees C, you would need CO2 emission change, or relative again to 2010, CO2 reductions of in the range of 91% to 97%. So there would still be a small amount of fossil fuels in operation, but essentially they would be phased out. So what would come in to substitute the clean sources of energy that would be needed to substitute for the fossil fuels? Their modeling had the doubling of nuclear power plants in operations today by double and also up to 5 times, depending on the scenario. So if we do the math, we currently have 440 operating reactors in the world. To double that number of reactors, we need to build a nuclear plant every 24 days. In the high case, we need to build 1 plant every 5 days to 2050. And so you can imagine that that's going to be a very, very difficult task. But in addition to nuclear, we would need to add renewables. These would be hydro, wind, and solar, but they would need to increase by 8 to 11 times to bring renewable share of electricity to the range of 71 to 80% by 2050, depending on the scenario. Currently, they are at 27. Again, that's a very, very large jump from where we are today to have an increase of 8 to 11 times. In addition to that, they also had biomass increasing where it is today by 4 times, up to 4 times, I should say. In one scenario, they had no increase and up to 4 times. Again, that's essentially a difficult task. In addition to all of that, as Kate mentioned, there would be CCS and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And you would need, to the end of the century, to 2100, 350 to 1190 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. That's 8 to 27 times the annual global emissions of 42 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. Not only do we need to net zero by 2050, but we need to take out more emissions than we put in. And we need all of that, the nuclear, the renewables, the biomass, and the CCS, and the bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Clearly, it is much easier to stop putting emission from into the atmosphere than removing it from the atmosphere. In their report, the IPCC declared that even though it is very difficult, it's still possible to limit global warming to a 1.5 degrees C increase. I'll let you decide if that is a fair statement. So what about Canada? Canada's emissions are essentially unchanged since 2000. For example, there were 730 megatons in 2005. There are at 730 megatons in 2019. And in between, they've bounced up and down, but from an engineering perspective, in the accuracy that you do these kinds of estimates, I think that they're essentially unchanged. If we examine the emissions by economic sectors and compare 2005, which is Canada's baseline year, to 2019, that's pre-pandemic, we see that the transport sector has increased by 16% and the oil and gas sector by 20%. And this has been compensated by a decrease in the electricity sector by 57% and heavy industry by 10%. For the oil and gas industry, the 20% increase in emission between 2005 and 2019 corresponded, and get this, to an 88% increase in crude oil production, mostly bitumen. And this is between 2005 and 2019. This is indeed very impressive and speaks to the success that the oil and gas sector has had in reducing GHG emissions. Think about it, 20% increase in emission, but 88% increase in production. I think that's pretty impressive. And according to Statistics Canada, crude oil export have increased in value by more than 15-fold since 1990, accounting for 14% of Canada's total exports in 2019. The value that the oil and gas industry provides to Canada will be very difficult to replace, and I think Jim made reference to that. The problem internationally is that it is very hard to come to an agreement between parties. Negotiations are slow, texts are watered down, and in the end, countries don't follow through with their commitments. On the other hand, there is much better chance for acting in a jurisdiction such as Alberta, which has an innovative, technology-focused culture. Mark Summer last week already described some of the innovative projects taking place in Alberta: hydrogen for transport, hydrogen for domestic use, making hydrogen byproduct, being a solid carbon black material, and charging system for buses in Calgary, and so on. I'll mention the large-scale proposals that have been announced. For example, the 6 oil sand producers representing over 90% of the production are working together to attain net zero emissions by 2050. TC Energy and Pembina Pipeline are developing plans for a world-scale carbon transportation and sequestration system. And Dow is looking to build the world's first net zero carbon emission ethylene cracker complex at Fort Saskatchewan. And I'm repeating what Kate said, Capital Power is collaborating with Enbridge on a CCUS development near Genesee. And Kate already mentioned that decarbonization of natural gas power. Capital Power is also looking at direct air capture. I think the technology makes no sense, that's my opinion, on a global scale because of the costs and the energy requirements. But at a local level, companies such as Capital Power it's likely a good match. And Kate already described how that makes sense. At the December 16th webinar, Mark Summer told us about Air Products' world-scale net zero hydrogen energy complex in Edmonton. It uses an autothermal reforming technology, an ATR, called ATR, instead of steam methane reforming. An ATR requires an oxygen plant. The advantage for ATR is that there is a pure stream of CO2 to capture, and capture can be close to 100%. The beauty of this project is that Air Products already has an existing market in the refining and fertilizer sector in Alberta, and they're looking to expand that to transportation of freight trucks, road trains, and passenger buses. The weakness with most of these proposals is that they are not going to happen without support from governments. Unfortunately, no help will likely come from the Trudeau government. One just has to read the mandate letters to the ministers that was published this week to appreciate that situation. So finally, I wanted to get to the key question, which is how do we in Alberta and Canada proceed from here? The first, I would say, is we have to not stray from acknowledging that climate change is a serious issue and we need to address. Second, Canada needs to build on its competitive advantage and pursue a distinct strategy with a planning based on rigorous scientific and engineering data and modeling that considers the structure of this country's economy. This could include sequencing of technology and understanding the future trajectory of technologies such as solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and hydrogen in the energy transition. This is the same point that Oskar Sigvaldsson made in his presentation last week, and Jim also mentioned the need for a Canada energy strategy, and this is how you support this kind of a strategy. Oskar was also the project manager of the 2016 Tragedy Energy Futures Report with a goal of an 80% reduction in GHG emission by 2050 relative to 1990 levels. This study stands out as the preeminent comprehensive engineering analysis of Canada's energy future system. Much has happened since 2016, and many things have come into the picture, such as that this study needs a serious update. The third thing that I think we need is to have more emphasis on low-hanging fruits, such as methane emission reductions, Arresting methane leakage and mitigating vented methane are the fastest and the most cost-effective approach in reducing CO2 emissions. And Sohail Askapur of PTAC has demonstrated that the technologies are available. The majority can reduce methane emission at negative cost, especially with the current price of natural gas. The challenge is to get industry to rapidly adopt and implement these mitigation technologies. Arresting methane leakage is also an important condition for making blue hydrogen viable as a climate-friendly option. Another low-hanging fruit is the use of natural system to capture CO2 emissions. Afforestation, reforestation, and soil carbon retention are powerful weapons for combating climate change and should receive greater emphasis. The forestry sector in Canada has an important role to play in climate change mitigation while promoting economic development through manufacturing of long-lived products that store wood, carbon longer, and replace steel and concrete with wood products. Most studies have emphasized electrification of industrial, home heating, and transportation, and the need to double or more that in our electricity system. Expanding renewables and hydro will be important, as well as a focus on hydrogen and nuclear. Blue hydrogen is Alberta's focus and a technology where Alberta wants to become a world leader, building on its strength and infrastructure on using hydrogen in upgrading, refining, and making fertilizer. The development of blue hydrogen needs to be pursued vigorously while recognizing that there are obstacles. The extra energy required in the integration of CCS. Hydrogen is also difficult to transport and difficult to store, but it can be shipped as ammonia and burned in power plants with no emissions. And an example of that is Saudi Arabia is actually doing that and shipping ammonia to Japan for use as a fuel. There's also a new hope for nuclear with the shifting emphasis on smaller and safer nuclear reactors or SMRs. Axel spoke about the revival for nuclear for both fission and fusion. And Eric Newell and I recently attended a discussion of 2 demonstration projects of a macro SMR, 300 megawatts at Darlington, which is designed for grid scale applications, and a micro SMR, 5 megawatts at Chalk River, designed for industrial application, potentially for the oil sand. Axel described it in more detail than I'm doing here. And the last point I'll make is that today it was announced that China has put into commercial operation its high temperature gas-cooled pebble bed reactor in Shandong province. This is the first unit of 2 with a generation capacity of about 200 megawatts. So things are advancing very fast in the fission reactions and SMR area. And we're starting to see commercial daylight. And I think from an Alberta perspective, we should maintain an active watching brief so we can move quickly when the time is right. I'll stop here and just thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Eddy. It's always good to listen to you. You've got such a broad knowledge base on all of the technologies that are happening. A couple of notes that I've taken here, and I've sort of formed this opinion lately in reading what I've read about the future, and that is that we're not going to be able to do what we're setting out to do here without 2 things, one of them being carbon capture and storage. We give a lot of airtime to that in Alberta right now, but the other one is in nuclear. And nuclear doesn't seem to have a champion, at least in Canada right now. And, you know, if you think about our position in Alberta, you would say, well, we don't have any uranium here, so, you know, maybe we shouldn't talk about that. But we have uranium right across the border, you know, in northern Saskatchewan. And I've been an underground miner. I started out my career at the 5,000 foot level underground, not on the end of a drill bit, but tunneling down there. And I know all about underground mining, cut and fill and all the rest of it. And I've always wondered why we could not take the position that our uranium mines could be the custodian of the fuel. and do a cradle to grave opportunity with those that want to use nuclear power. Yeah. And you might not get a corporation to be willing to underwrite that, but if the government of Canada said, look, we want to do this for the world to help it happen, they could backstop any liability. And just not unlike what you do in catalyst in the refining business, where the refiner doesn't really own the catalyst, they really just rent it. And others take it, the supplier takes it and removes the metals. You could do the same thing here, where the miner takes the spent uranium back and puts it in concrete caves and cements it in underground where it came from. So I think there's opportunities there too that we haven't really explored. And that's why I think, we need a bit more of a total Canada approach that would involve coordination with all the provinces to do this. But anyway, Eddie, thank you for giving us those insights and some really good facts there that I didn't appreciate myself. I knew that we'd gone up significantly in production on oil, but I didn't know that we'd only increased 20% of CO2 emissions, but we'd increased our oil output by 88%. That's very significant. So now, if I can, I'm going to move on to Dave. And Dave has got a great oversight of the industry from his role in CAP and his role in the in the business for so many years. And Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can share your perspective with us. I think it should be really valuable.
Hey, thanks, Jim, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in the webinar. I'm going to build on Kate and Eddy's comments by touching on three areas. The first being just a little bit of a perspective on how I view the current external context in which we find ourselves. Second, a few thoughts on what's going on in terms of investment in technology and innovation in Alberta. And then third, some thoughts on key considerations that I think we should have in mind as we try and frame up an approach going forward. So just to ground my remarks, let me start with a few thoughts on the external context. And I think one way to look at this is I think we've got, might characterize it as two trains on a bit of a collision course with each other at the moment. On the one hand, I'm an engineer, but I can do the economist thing. On the one hand, on the other hand, we've got extremely ambitious climate aspirations in a Canadian context, as reflected in the GHG reduction targets that have been established toward achieving net zero by 2050. It's characterized clearly by significant political momentum in response to the prevailing climate science, and as recently reflected in the outcome of COP26. We've got increasing activism and intervention by the financial community in many different ways. Certainly societal momentum spurred by much of the media. I think, as I see it, at least unprecedented government policy and regulatory intervention, which is most visibly evident, I think, in the policy direction currently being pursued by our federal government, and significant growth in investment in clean technology in its many forms. On the other hand, we've got a number of what I would characterize as hard realities related to the net zero aspiration. And these need to be confronted and addressed, I think, if we're going to make progress. And we do need to make progress. I think both Kate and Eddy touched on the need for continued affordable, reliable energy systems in support of growing energy demand. Hydrocarbons are going to have to play a role in the system for quite some time, I believe. I think there's a question as to the capacity and capability and foresight, maybe, of policymakers to intervene with clarity in our energy, economic, and social systems, as the current trends suggest that they will and have the intention to. I think you can almost argue it's unprecedented in a peacetime environment to see the level of intervention that may be forthcoming from governments. And I think the related issue that doesn't get an awful lot of attention is the ability of the regulators to actually manage the download that is inevitably coming their way. Fair enough to talk about policy, but that ultimately ends up in the regulatory system. Just the sheer enormity of the financial and physical infrastructure challenges that are going to be necessary to essentially reconstruct, if you will, our energy systems over the next 30 years or so. And I think there's a a very important question about the realistic pace at which technology, transformative technology, can be developed and deployed at scale. And Kate highlighted the fact that if we're looking at 2030, it's technology we know about today that's going to have to lead to those changes, not the technology of tomorrow. So I think if you roll all that up and say, in the face of those deeply polarizing discussions that are evident out there, and this potential impending train wreck as with these two inexorable forces on a bit of a collision course, I think it'd be quite easy just to throw up your hands and say, well, it's just impossible or very difficult to chart a path forward. That's the wrong answer. I think these are not insurmountable problems, but we need to find a way to work much more collaboratively and much more in the solution space if we're going to make progress and on the ground and despite that very challenging external context. So if we look at technology and innovation and what can we do in Alberta on the ground to make progress around pathways to net zero and energy and economic sustainability, investment in technology innovation is going to be a critical factor. I think we'd all agree. I think those investments need to address two imperatives. The first is to sustain the competitiveness and reduce GHG emissions from our existing economy. And the second is to leverage our current strengths and pursue new initiatives to create a competitive future economy. We need to do both of those things. And Jim, back to your point, I think too often it's one or the other, but not both. It's not all going to be new, and it's not all going to be old. We need to find a way to find the right mix between them. There's, I think, numerous examples of great work being done in Alberta on the technology and innovation front. And that great work, I think, has all kinds of potential in terms of transforming the Alberta economy and addressing greenhouse gas emissions. But I think it's also got relevance and applicability both nationally and globally that often doesn't get enough recognition. So just to touch on a few examples, and this is by no means intended to be a complete list. COSIA, Canada's Oil Sands Innovation Alliance, now about a decade old, very innovative collaborative alliance among oil sands companies. It continues to deliver game-changing technology and greenhouse gas emissions, land, water, tailings, et cetera. PTAC, the Petroleum Technology Alliance of Canada, is doing great work on methane detection and mitigation, which is relevant, obviously, in the natural gas sector, particularly in Canada, but has broad applicability, I think, in the production and processing of natural gas nationally and globally. Eddy mentioned small modular nuclear reactors. Canadian Nuclear Association, the federal government, a number of provincial governments have really created some renewed momentum around SMRs, which have potential for use in the oil sands. Still some issues to be resolved, but as a source of energy to reduce the use of natural gas for steam generation. The Oil Sands Pathway to Net Zero initiative, again, I think a potential game-changing alliance among Canada's largest oil sands producers to work together on pathways to net zero. The initial focus is on building out a carbon capture network in Northern Alberta. I think, Jim, you mentioned earlier, and it's hard to foresee any pathway to net zero in Canada that does not involve CCUS at a significant scale. Alberta Innovates doing some really positive work, I think, on technology development in many areas. Hydrogen, bitumen beyond combustion are ones that stand out for me. And finally, you mentioned Emissions Reduction Alberta, Jim. Again, an organization that invests the carbon levy, the revenue from the carbon levy on large final emitters across a range of sectors in the economy: oil and gas, low emitting electricity, bio, and industrial processes and products. So we've got an awful lot of good work going on in Alberta, I think, that often doesn't get enough recognition. More can and should be done, I would argue, to amplify and accelerate those current efforts. And just to build on a comment that I think Eddy made, I think there's clearly a role for the federal government to play a larger role in funding and supporting some of these initiatives that are important to Alberta and to Canada. So let me just wrap up with a few thoughts on key considerations, as I would characterize it, that I believe should inform our decision-making as we look forward toward a pathway to energy, economic, and environmental sustainability, as the webinar was framed. The first is that I think we need to have a much more grounded, balanced, and pragmatic dialogue about solutions to the energy and climate challenge and how it may play out in a global, national, and regional context. I think aspirational objectives are great. They may help to motivate and create the case for change, but that approach only goes so far. And I think we're at the point where we need to have a bit of a hard reality check, if you will, and deal with some of the tough issues that people don't seem to want to directly deal with. As an engineer, I can say this: perhaps we need a few more engineers around the table and a few less climate scientists. I think the problem is well understood. The solutions need some work. Second, we need to start to, I think, more consistently and more deliberately view net zero, not as a climate aspiration or in the climate silo, but rather as an integrated energy, environmental / climate economy challenge. This is an extremely complex systems challenge. It's not a climate problem in and of itself. And far too much of the discussion, I think, today takes place in silos. And we are not going to make the progress we need to make unless we can take a more cross-cutting approach and a more integrated approach. We need better planning, better process, and more collaboration across those silos if we're going to make progress. Third, this is definitely not a smooth transition. I think it's a transformation, not a transition to net zero. Nor is there one pathway. We aren't smart enough to figure out what that pathway is. There's multiple potential pathways. It's going to be a very long, very disruptive, very challenging road ahead. And all that to say that I think we need to look at this complex systems problem in more of a scenarios context than more of a portfolio context. There is no one right answer, and we need to look at a diversity of potential solutions. Fourth, as I characterize it, we need to ride two horses. It's far from clear to me at this point how Canada is going to be able to compete in the at scale as we transition to net zero. And it seems frankly absurd to me that we would jump off our current resource-based economic horse before we have a horse or horses to jump onto. And those horses we would potentially jump onto are far from evident at the moment. So I think we need to realize that our current economy, albeit one with lower GHG emissions, needs to play a significant role. And it can help to provide the financial and other capacity to help us transition to a more diverse and more diverse economy into new opportunities. And fifth and finally, I think we need to realize that the future of many of our resource-based, export-oriented resource sectors are going to, including oil and gas, are going to be driven largely by what happens in the marketplace, not so much by what we do internally in Canada. Although I wouldn't underestimate our ability to mess it up if given the opportunity. But I think what's really important is that we ought to have and should have the opportunity to participate in global markets, to compete in those global markets, and demand in those global markets at the end of the day will dictate in my view, largely the pace and nature of the transition that we need to undertake in Canada. So let me just wrap up with a couple of quick points. I think the first, I just emphasize the need for a reality check, the tough conversation, and dealing with those issues that people don't seem to want to deal with. If we deal with them constructively, collaboratively, it'll serve us much better in the end. We can and should ride two horses. Let's enhance our current economy. Let's deal with emissions from our current economic structure, and let's use that to leverage and create opportunities for the future. Let's recognize that we can do more, but there's an awful lot of good work being done on technology and innovation in Canada and in Alberta, and it's relevant nationally and it's relevant on a global scale in many cases. Let's not sell ourselves short with regard to the impressive work that is being done. And finally, I just highlight the fact that we need to get this message out there more effectively, more consistently. It needs to be grounded in results and deliverables, but we've got a good story to tell. And we all need to work tell that story better and more consistently. So I'll leave it at that, Jim, and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much for that great overview, Dave. You made some really good points, and I like you did it a lot more eloquently than I did in my opening remarks around, the systems challenge, which is kind of what I was trying to get at about, how we need to really look at industry. We need to look at the regulatory approval process. We need to look at the economics of what we're doing and make sure that those are all in balance as we go forward. But I think one of the ones, and you touched on it too, is that we also need to have governments in Canada indicating and being supportive of what industry is trying to do. Industry's been asked to do this, and now we've been challenged to go out and solve this problem, but you've got absolutely no indication, certainly not at the federal government level, as to whether it'll be appreciated, it's even wanted. It's not being supported verbally at all. Anytime I look, I can't find that. So even though they're obviously going to need to be involved in funding some of this, but they also need to be there for moral support for the people that are trying to do this. And yep. Eric, I go back to the National Oil Sands Task Force work that you led. You were constantly working with the politicians to make sure they were on side and looking for signals from them that indicated that they were, as you were moving the whole thing forward. We don't get any of that opportunity now today. And I'll just remind everybody that was a Liberal Prime Minister working with a very conservative Alberta Premier that joined together to do something of significant national benefit called the oil sands. And we haven't seen any of that recently, certainly not in the last 4 or 5 years. And if we're going to undertake something like this for the Canadian economy, we've got to have that. We've got to have that. We've got to have that tough dialogue that you talked about.
Well, I think Jim, to your point, some of us have been involved in the notion of some sort of energy strategy, industrial strategy, whatever you want to call it, for quite some time. And I think the Oil Sands Task Force is a good example of what can be achieved if there's clarity of purpose.
Right.
But we haven't had that clarity of purpose. And in fact, I think we operate at cross purposes many times. And I think that makes it very difficult for industry business in Canada to sort of, what needs to be done. And amid all of that uncertainty, now, people need to take decisions, they need to move forward. But I think if we had a more aligned and consistent approach to strategy around energy and climate, we'd be much better off. Now, going to my point about tough choices, I think one of the reasons we haven't had that is it actually does force tough choices and tough conversations. And my experience in a lot of this is that there's a tremendous capacity of people to try and avoid the necessity of having those conversations, but they're needed. And that's, I think that's where we need to get to, but haven't been successful in doing so far.
A couple of things really stand out as an outsider sort of looking in. One of them was almost the first sentence which was expressed today, and that is an acknowledgement that something needs to be done. Canada cannot stick its head in the sand or simply proclaim we're going to reduce by 1.5% emissions on the earth, and that's going to be enough. There's more needed. And I think first acknowledging and letting the public know that we have acknowledged that change is called for. The second thing that's really obvious is industry is making an adaptation. In 2015 at a conference in Red Deer, of the general public, they said number one was energy transition. Well, the industry is adapting. It's adapting to market forces. In discussions we've had with those in the United States, they've said, like it or not, the market has accepted the fact that we need to deal with emissions. Nobody's running away from that, either as industry or those engaged in innovation. The one thing that is lacking is our government. Innovation isn't lacking. Technology isn't lacking. Industry's commitment isn't lacking. The global geopolitics isn't lacking. What seems to be lacking is an appreciation by our government of what Canada really ought to do, other than simply proclaim it's going to be nice, good, helpful. Anybody want to jump in there? Yeah, go ahead, Alona.
Alberta has a great story, but Alberta doesn't know how to tell it. And we don't know how to tell it because we're not using the right language. We are using numbers and figures, and we need metaphors, gentlemen. This is a cell phone. And you know what? I don't know how many watts of energy it uses. I don't care. But until renewables can charge my cell phone full time, I am going to rely on natural gas because it's the one thing that is reliable. So how much does this take to recharge this cell phone? You gentlemen are all talking facts and figures, and they are fascinating, but you need a quick story, like 15 seconds. The world needs Alberta energy and Alberta innovation. That's the story we need to tell. Through Kate and Dave and Jim, but focus on the metaphors.
Well, the point was made, not just about technology, not just about recognizing our natural resource position, not just recognizing what we can do in a backup role and what we are doing now, but public education. I mean, the public needs to be more aware, and I think that's a point you're making, Alona, whether it be stories or political action from on high. The public needs to embrace and understand that Canada can lead. I'm an immigrant to Alberta from the US. I have been astounded at the role that Alberta has played in the North American economy in the last 50 years since I've been here, since the oil stands evolved. As Clinton noted when he came and visited Alberta, you're on a world stage, and we should be on that world stage, not just about pumping out our past, but recognizing we can play a role in the global future. Who knows what integrated planning is? Oscar, you raised this, and it seemed to me it came up incidentally several times. But if we have a path forward and planning is part of it, integrated or collaborative planning seems to be something that has been raised. It's either taking place, and it has taken place in the oil industry. Jim, you and Dave made note over and over again about CASIA. But that's viewed by the public as the energy industry, the oil and gas guys doing something for themselves. Integrated planning seems to me to be broader than that. Oscar, can you elaborate?
Yeah, I'm happy to elaborate on that. Of course, worked with Eddy and Dave on this for a long time, ever since we worked together on the Collier project. But the idea of integrated planning really consists of two elements. One is that you have a group of professionals that span a very broad range of disciplines who are able to look at all of the options and systematically work towards solutions that satisfy a defined objective. In the work that we did on the Collier project, we defined the objective as minimizing the present worst cost of the future stream of investment and operating costs to meet a series of GHG mitigation targets over time. So that was accepted as the goal, and all of the analytical work that we did was really related to delivering on that goal. And that was the basis for the comparison. Now so you start off with a team, but then you have to also have an approach and methodology that fully integrates the range of possible solutions, which are solutions that include economic impacts, GHG mitigation results, and transformation of the energy system. So in the work that we did there, we did 11 scenarios, and these were defined by different people and so on. So that's an example of comprehensive integrated planning, which is rigorous, fact-based, and obviously intended to be very sound. But the idea then is that you do a certain number of these scenarios, and then you have to address the decision process. And the decision process is really something which Dave has emphasized here is you have to get all of the actors together, key decision makers together, who have to have the tough discussions that really focus on what are the interactions between the various scenarios. And I would call them the promising scenarios. And you look at, what are the costs and what are the impacts and what are the political ramifications. and so on. So that's the kind of dialogue that is critically important, but you have to integrate the planning. You know, it has to be a comprehensive planning approach with a decision approach, and it should also underpin orderly selection of technology developments, so that you really begin to focus on what are the most important areas. And Eddy has highlighted a lot of that, and Kate did as well, in terms of what's going on in EPCOR.
So Oscar, for such an approach to work, it's either underway right now, and you can tell us who's leading it, or two, is there someone with the stature, the credibility at the public level, much as at the political level, that could initiate such an undertaking?
Well, there is a group that is trying to move the thing along, and we've got very strong support from the Canadian Academy of Engineering. And, in terms of making sure that we have webinars that are focused on trying to improve the knowledge base out there, and so on. So it's a relatively small group at this stage. So we try to be low key. We've tried to be a motivator for informed dialogue, and move away from polarized discussions and so on.
One more question, then I'm going to call on James. I see James is itching to share with us some insights that he has. Sometimes a conference like COP19, could Canada do an international conference and put a new brand on it? Not necessarily led by you-know-who, but could Canada do an international conference, bringing the various forces together? I mean, what I'm hearing in terms of talent and the grassroots leadership that we have in this country, not necessarily at the top, but in the middle, is astounding. Couldn't we do an international conference and get our brand recognized as something other than 1.5? I'll leave it at that. Go ahead, James.
I could start out and respond to that your last point.
Go ahead, James.
The issue for us, what I've heard today, is about the media. You're not getting, you're explaining that you have done, or in Alberta has done a lot of really good things, but you're not getting credit for it, or you get very little public attention. That's the way the media works. The media works on the negative, not on the positive. And my pitch, based on a lot of effort in this area since 1990, over 1 million readers on my blog, and an editor of academia.edu. And what I really urge is a rethinking of the basic assumption. The basic assumption is wrong. The science of global warming by human emissions of CO2 is not settled.
But we're not talking about that. We're talking about.
Yes, but you are. You've assumed that throughout the whole tonight. The whole night, all you've talked about, right, starting with Jim, was how we need to reduce our CO2. You've gone in with the greenhouse gas stuff. You have not gone forward. The assumption of the entire webinar has been wrong. The assumption is that there is a problem.
Jim,
and let me just end, because we're running out of time. Don't believe me, read this book.
Harry, can I throw an oar in the water here with the work we're doing?
Sure, go ahead.
One of the interesting things that that Kate mentioned, and then it was sort of followed in a different way by Eddy, that Kate talks about technology and adaptation, and obviously the power company that she works for might be a leader in across the continent about adapting technology. And Eddy alluded to the fact that industries we're having difficulty to get industries adapt. I'm a part of a think tank called Rethinking Capital, and what we're doing is we're saying, what are the constraints that are causing a very slow process of adaptation, okay, to new technologies and whatnot. And Kate alluded to the fact we need massive amounts of capital. Well, we've got lots of capital. There's capital out of the yin yang, okay, and the technologies are developing over and over and over. We have a joint venture going right now with Harvard University that talks about measuring certain kind of things. The problem from a simple point of view is that if you want industry to adapt, the incentives that are out there for industry are all upside down. For a corporation to go out and adapt and spend large amounts of capital to adapt. Right now, the way, I'm an accountant, by the way, the way the accountants will record that is as an expense. Well, if you increase your expenses, that means your profits are lower, your share price is lower, and CEOs get fired over that. Our joint venture with Harvard is suggesting that, in fact, these kind of investments are really assets, and they should enhance the value of a corporation. The different, this is not tangible, but this is intangible. And so until we get that straight, that any adaptation that takes place, in fact, is enhancing the value of a corporation that's trying to go out and become a good citizen. Right now, you think of it. Right now, you're trying to become a good guy or the good citizen. Now the incentives are all upside down. And so we're actually in the process of working right now with CPA Canada and 2 other international accounting organizations that say, you guys need to get your business straight and allow companies and organizations to, in fact, say that any kind of adaptation, any kind of adopting the technology and whatnot, in fact, is enhancing the value of your corporation from the point of view of human, what people think. So the slowness of this all deals with, is there enough technology to do it? I think, Kate, you suggested that there is technology. You are using technology. How come the other 500 or so power generators and utility companies around North America aren't doing that? It's an interesting question, isn't it? Yes. And then Eddy talked about the fact that the industries are very, very slow to adapt. Well, the problem is that when they adapt, the measurements are all crazy. Okay, so we're in the process of getting that fixed. And so it's a very, very slow process because, the industry that I belong to says, oh, you're crazy. Anyway. So if you believe that maybe you would like to throw your oar in the water with that, contact Perry and we will give you a link to what we're doing. It's called Rethinking Capital. We've got an international think tank that is saying, ooh, wow, if you could go there, we're going to speed this process up, because everybody's talking about there are adaptations available to us. If you open the floodgates of capital, there's going to be many, many more. But the constraints right now are that if in fact somebody tries to adapt to that, it's badness instead of goodness.
I don't mind just commenting on Joseph's comments just now. It sounds great doing that. Somehow taking it off balance sheet or not having the management team bayoneted when they don't get the results that everybody's looking for. But that was tried a few years ago for human capital. There was an attempt to put a dollar value on that, and it didn't really land. It didn't really work. It was a good effort, but it didn't work. And I guess I would wonder at the end of the day, how do you educate the shareholders? They've got to be able to go along with that. And today we've got all kinds of shareholder activism that's going on. We've got, the engine number ones of the world. We've got activist shareholders that can grab a small portion of a company and turn it upside down. Everybody's, and the big funds, the BlackRocks of the world are all saying that they're not going to invest in the energy industry. We've got Case backing away from everything except pipelines. I don't know why they don't get rid of their pipelines if they don't like oil and gas. But, how do you square all of that at the end of the day? The balance sheet has got to be the ultimate measure. That's the thing that the shareholders look at. What's my total shareholder return? What's the stock price and what was the dividend?
That's a very interesting comment, and you're absolutely right. But
we'll note it.
Sure. Yep.
Kate, we've got about 5 more minutes. Kate, are there any closing comments you'd like to share with us? And then I'll ask Eddy the same, and Dave, and then I'll make some closing remarks and we'll call it a night. Kate, any concluding points you'd like to make?
Well, thanks, Perry. I think we can all agree voters, consumers, and investors are the same person, and they really fundamentally don't understand this. And Ilona has suggested that we need a better story. And I've got to tell you, Ilona, lots of big brains have been working on that elevator speech for a very long time. The problem is it is so complex, it's very difficult to reduce. And so what we have now is a whole bunch of people that are getting their science off of headlines and tweets and so on. And it's very, very difficult to combat that because they're oversimplistic. They're intuitively attractive because they're so much easier to understand than the real poop. And we really need to educate it. My frustration, I guess, is I participate in webinars like this quite frequently, and it seems like I'm always talking to the choir. And somehow, I think probably to Dave's very good point, we have to bring in the people elsewhere in the church too and have those conversations with them. But I really enjoyed this very much, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Mary. I have 2 points to make. One of the things that I think is really missing is a good market intelligence, not only on technology, but on market trends and where things are going. And I don't think we have a systematic way of doing that. And that would add, I think, to the whole area of making sure that we understand how these systems are evolving and putting a systems approach together. The other thing that I think needs to be emphasized is the whole area of adaptation. And it's time for us to put equal emphasis on adaptation as we're doing on mitigation in the form of investments in infrastructure to protect communities from the extreme weather events that are happening. Canada is actually warming at twice the rate of the rest of the world. And we're going to get the same extreme events that we've had in BC. And 100 people and over 100 people died in June last year. And that shouldn't be happening in Canada. We should be having, it's just unacceptable for that to happen. So I think increased emphasis on adaptation to make sure that our infrastructure is sustainable, that we can react fast enough for any disasters that are coming up and coming needs to be done as well. So my 2 cents.
Thank you, Eddy. Dave?
Yeah, maybe just Perry, just very quickly. I've been involved, like Kate, in these discussions about communications for way too long. My takeaway is 2 things. One is the public is, for the most part, at least a general level, very concerned about the environment, and they take the energy system for granted. So we can talk all we want about how we engage with that. I think personally, and I hope this doesn't happen, but I think it's going to take a bit of a wake-up call, similar to what we're seeing in the UK, to actually get people's attention, because until it actually resonates and impacts them directly, I think it's a very esoteric and somewhat detached issue. So we'll see how it unfolds, but I can assure people that the brightest brains in communications in Canada have been involved in this subject of how to communicate around this subject for the last 15 years.
Jim here, could I just make one more comment?
Sure.
And I forget the last name of the individual that was talking earlier on. Jim was his name, and we dispensed of his comment rather quickly. And to his point, one of the issues that we're dealing with here is that we never really did have the right level of conversation about man-made CO2 and its contribution to global warming. We did not settle the science.
Correct.
And we got to the point where we've divided, everybody now. You're either, the minute you have any conversation around that, you're put over in the penalty box as a naysayer and a negative person and all the rest, unless you're rah behind everything over here.
Right.
And somewhere in the middle is probably the right answer, but we'll never arrive if we don't have the conversation. I don't think the conversation's been had. And that's a real travesty. And it makes it a lot more difficult now to deal with this going forward. So I really
appreciate that, Jim.
Yep.
I think that's a very fundamental point. I published in the Globe and Mail my first article. I was president of the Business Council of British Columbia in 1990. And I said at that time, the science is not settled. So we should not jump in bed with some activity that may not be useful. And that's exactly what we have done. This whole discussion is about something that may not matter.
I'm just going to say that it's very difficult for industry to take that position today. The train's left the station, and you would be bringing all kinds of negative notoriety, especially if you're publicly traded, to any company. And it's too bad that it happened that way, but nevertheless, that's where we find ourselves today.
Well, I think the point you've made, Jim, and I had it right here on my note. My first line was, the train has left the station. We had a webinar on acknowledging that climate change may be challenged. We had one that on let's accept the facts. But this webinar, we said, and we accepted the fact that something is being done, what is being done, and that's what we wanted to talk about. We wanted to talk about the state of the global economy. We wanted to talk about the energy industry globally. And during that period, we learned that demand is continuing.
Can I just make one quick point on that?
You're not going to run away from fossil fuels. And that point has been made today. Secondly, change is underway. Not only has the train left the station, but change is well underway. And we've heard that repeatedly now for three weeks into this third webinar. And the changes that are underway are significant and often unrecognized, which is unfortunate. We do need leadership. Not just at the industry level. We need leadership within the environmental sector. We need leadership among those that are stewards of the economy. And we need, as Oscar has made the point quite well, we need integrated planning. We need them to work together. The story cannot come from simply one source. It's got to be a joint effort. And that talks about the transitioning of our economy. Whether or not it's climate change that's driving the change in the economy, there are changes in the economy that are needed to diversify Canada's economy. We have been a natural resource economy. We have been a supplier, typically north-south, wheat, meat, fiber, timber, oil, gas. That's been our past. That can't be the sole activity of our economy of our future. And that calls for integrated planning and calls for some form of government leadership. So it's after 5:30. Again, I thank you, Jim, for your excellent moderating today. For each of the presenters for their preparation, Dave, Kate, and Eddy. I say thank you for all of you. It's 5:30. You can go home now. If you wish to stay on for the after party, sometimes the debate is richer and more volatile. But let's hope that volatile event that we think might trigger the big change doesn't happen. But we've seen in Europe, the geopolitical events have brought about some very significant adjustments being called for. And let's hope that we don't have the wildfires that are being forecast. So with that, I say good night, and we're on the train.
Wildfires are not started by climate change.
Thanks, everybody.